July 1996. Two men wading in the Columbia River pull a smooth rock from the shallows. It has teeth, it has eye sockets, it is a human skull, and it is nearly 9,000 years old, one of the most complete ancient skeletons ever found in America. Then the man who examined it says something that starts a 20-year war. The face, he says, does not look Native American. That single word, detonated. Lawyers, tribes, the FBI, the U.S. Army. And behind all of it, a question nobody wanted answered: who was allowed to rewrite the timeline of the Americas? Start with the object, because the object is where the trouble begins. Well, Thomas and David Deasy were wading along the bank near Kennewick, Washington, during the hydroplane races when Thomas hit something round with his foot. He thought it was a stone. He lifted a skull with the teeth still in it. They stashed it on the bank, watched the boats, then went to the police. The coroner, Floyd Johnson, thought the bone looked too old for a murder case. So he called a local archaeologist named James Chatters. Chatters went back to that riverbank and, in the fading light, pulled more than 300 bones and fragments out of the mud, almost an entire person. Then he found the thing that should have ended any simple explanation. Buried in the man's hip, healed into the bone, was a stone spear point, a cascade-style point, the kind used thousands of years ago. This man had been speared, and he had survived it long enough for the wound to close around the stone. A tool outlived the hand that threw it. That was the first clue that this was old. It was not the last surprise. Chatters sent a sliver of hand bone to a lab for radiocarbon dating. The number came back around 8,400 years. Calibrated, somewhere close to 9,000 calendar years. That is not just old. That is one of the oldest, most complete human skeletons ever recovered on the continent. A rare, priceless window into the first Americans. And here is where a scientist's honest observation turned into a bomb. Chatters looked at the long skull and the narrow face and said the features did not match modern Native Americans. In his notes, the word was Caucasoid. A forensic sculptor built a clay reconstruction of the face. When it was finished, people said it looked like the actor Patrick Stewart, a 9,000-year-old man from Washington State who supposedly looked European. That is all it took, because a certain crowd heard exactly what they wanted. Fringe writers pushing the idea that Europeans reached America first, even white nationalist groups who filed their own claim to the bones. Suddenly, a healed hip wound and a lab result had turned into a weapon in a fight about who really got here first. Chatters himself said he was not claiming Europeans settled America. Didn't matter. The word was already loose. Now hold that thought, because the people who actually lived along that river had a very different word for him. Not specimen, not Caucasoid, ancestor. 5 tribes, the Umatilla, the Yakima, the Nez Perce, the Colville, and the Wanapum, recognized the remains immediately as one of their own. They called him the Ancient One. Their oral traditions placed them on that land, as they put it, since time immemorial. To them, digging into his bones was not research, it was desecration. And they had a law on their side. The skull was found on federal land, controlled by the United States Army Corps of Engineers. Under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, passed in 1990, remains like this are supposed to go back to affiliated tribes for reburial. The Corps agreed. They moved to hand him over. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it was the beginning of the war, because 8 scientists sued the United States government to stop the reburial. Led by the Smithsonian's Douglas Owsley, with a physical anthropologist named Robson Bonnickson as the named plaintiff, they argued this skeleton was too important to bury unstudied. They said no clear link had been proven between these ancient bones and any living tribe, so NAGPRA, they argued, should not apply. Read that again. The scientists cast the tribes and the law protecting native graves as the obstacle standing between them and knowledge. This is where the story stops being about one skull. It becomes about who gets to hold the pen when the timeline of a continent gets written. And that skeleton in Kennewick was not alone. He was one crack in a wall that had already been groaning for decades. To understand why one skeleton could trigger 20 years of lawsuits, you have to understand the wall. It has a name. Clovis, first. For most of the 20th century, the accepted story was clean. Humans reached the Americas about 13,000 years ago, walking down through an ice-free corridor from Asia. The proof was a beautiful, fluted stone spear point, first identified near Clovis, New Mexico in the 1930s. Clovis points showed up across North America. Nothing convincing showed up underneath them, so the rule became Clovis was first. Nobody was here before. And the rule hardened into something more than science. It became a career structure. An archaeologist named James Adavasio put it bluntly. Over 500 sites in the Americas had been claimed as older than Clovis. Each one, he said, got a Warhol-style 15 minutes of fame before someone found a fatal flaw and buried it. Claiming your site was pre-Clovis was close to professional suicide. So to break that wall, you didn't just need an old date. You needed a site so well preserved that nobody could wave it away. And in the 1970s, that site turned up. Not in North America. In a cold bog in southern Chile. Its name was Monte Verde. A young archaeologist named Tom Dillahay started excavating it in 1978 with a colleague, Mario Pino. What they pulled out of that waterlogged ground was not a handful of stones you could argue about. It was a settlement, the remains of a hut, tent stakes with knotted cords still wrapped around them, hearths, wooden tools, chewed leaves, and seaweed carried from a shoreline more than 50 miles away. The date came back around 14,500 years, more than 1,000 years before Clovis, on the wrong continent, thousands of miles south of the corridor that was supposed to be the only way in. The field did not simply disagree, it came for the site. For nearly 2 decades, Dillahay's work met what one account calls virulent resistance. He wasn't just defending a number, he was arguing against the shape of an entire discipline. He spent the better part of 20 years being doubted for finding evidence that arrived before the field was ready to hear it. Then, in 1997, a panel of senior archaeologists flew to Chile to inspect Monteverde in person. They looked at the ground, and they endorsed it. One of them said it plainly, Monteverde broke the pre-Clovis barrier. But here's the part that should bother you. Even now, decades later, some critics still contest those dates. The fight over Monteverde never fully closed. That's the pattern you need to watch, because it repeats. The evidence wins, and the argument still won't die. So if Chile could be that old, what had North America been sitting on the whole time? The answer had been waiting in Pennsylvania, buried under the word contamination. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, excavated by that same James Adavasio, a deep, layered site with clean stratigraphy, a stack of occupation floors, one on top of the next, going down and back in time. And the lower layers gave dates older than 13,000 years, possibly close to 16,000. The objection came fast, and it sounded devastating. Old carbon, critics said. Groundwater carrying ancient carbon could have seeped in and made the samples read older than they were, and the creekbed soil was soft enough, they argued, that artifacts might have slowly sunk from younger layers into older ones. That sounds technical. It is not. It's an accusation. It says the site isn't old. It says the dig was sloppy. Here's the thing. The more researchers checked the stratigraphy, the harder that answer got to hold. The layers stayed stubborn. The site never actually died. It just sat there, radioactive in every sense, too clean to dismiss, and too early to accept. And this is the quiet cruelty of the whole story. The easiest way to bury a discovery is not to destroy it. It's to make the person who found it look careless. Call it contamination long enough, and you never have to explain the layer at all. Now come back to that drawer in Washington, because while these fights raged, the ancient one had been sitting in legal limbo, and in 2004, the scientists won. A federal court ruled the remains were not legally Native American under NAGPRA, because, the court said, no cultural link to any living tribe had been proven across 9,000 years. So the skeleton could not be reburied. It could be studied. Douglas Owsley and his team finally got their hands on the bones, housed at the Burke Museum in Seattle, and what they found made the tribe's claim look, on paper, weaker than ever. The man was tall for his time. His bones showed a hard life, fractured ribs, that old spear wound, heavy use. Chemical signatures in the bone pointed to a diet heavy in marine food, a coastal traveler. And the skull measurements, run again and again, suggested his closest matches were not modern Native Americans at all. They pointed toward the Ainu of Japan, toward Polynesians, toward people from across the Pacific. So there it was, seemingly settled by the measurements. The ancient one was a mystery man, an outsider, exactly what the Not Native American headline had promised back in 1996, except the skull was about to be overruled by something the 2004 court never had. And before we get there, the whole argument was about to stop being invisible. It was about to become something you could see with your own eyes. Footprints. White Sands National Park, New Mexico. A dry, blinding gypsum flat that was once the muddy shore of an ancient lake. Pressed into that old lake bed, researchers found trails of human footprints. Not tools, you can argue, slipped through soil. Not bones, you can argue, were misread. Footprints. A person walking across wet ground, one step at a time. In 2021, a team dated them by radiocarbon on seeds caught in the print layers. The number came back between 21,000 and 23,000 years. Sit with that for a second. Clovis said 13,000. Monteverde pushed it to 14.5. Meadowcroft strained towards 16. White Sands did not nudge the line. It shattered it. It put human beings in North America at the peak of the last ice age, when the ice sheets were supposed to have sealed the continent shut. A footprint is not a molecule in a lab. A footprint is a person standing exactly where the model says nobody could have been. So the objection came, and it was clever. The seeds they dated came from an aquatic plant. And aquatic plants can pull in old carbon from the water they grow in, carbon that makes them read older than they really are. The reservoir effect. One tidy word and the whole terrifying date could be waved away. For a moment, that felt decisive. Then the researchers went back and attacked their own result from new angles. They dated pollen from land plants, which do not have the water problem. Same age. They ran optically stimulated luminescence, a method that measures when the sand grains themselves last saw sunlight. Same age. Later work added dated mud cores. By the end, dozens of samples across multiple methods pointed at the same window. The objection that was supposed to kill White Sands ended up making it stronger. New technology dragged the evidence back into the room and slammed the door. It is still not universally accepted. Real scientists still push back. But you can feel the shape of it now. Every time the wall got hit, it moved backward, and it never moved forward again. Which brings us to the edge of the map. The claim so extreme that almost nobody accepts it. And I want to be honest with you about exactly how far out on the branch we're going. The Cerruti Mastodon site, near San Diego. Bones of a mastodon, unearthed during highway work, found smashed in a specific way. The kind of breakage you get when someone cracks bone with a hammerstone to get at the marrow. Beside them, heavy stones that could have been hammers and anvils. In 2017, a team published in the journal Nature and put a number on it that stopped the room cold. 130,000 years, not 13,000, 130. That would put someone, some kind of human, in California more than 100,000 years before humans were thought to be anywhere in the Americas. Most experts rejected it flatly, and the reasons are fair. There are no clear stone tools, only broken bone and rocks. Heavy equipment on a highway project can smash bone too. As one archaeologist put it, that made it a very easy claim to dismiss. So, no. This does not prove humans were in America 130,000 years ago. Do not let anyone tell you it does. But here's why it still matters, and why it belongs in this story. Once the timeline started sliding, 13, 15, 23,000, the argument lost its comfortable edge. There was no longer a hard wall where everyone agreed the story stopped. When the ceiling has already been ripped off twice, even a claim you reject starts to feel less absurd than it should. That's not proof, that's pressure. And pressure was building from a direction nobody had been digging in at all, not up in the layers, out in the water. Because there's a problem hiding underneath this entire debate. And it's the reason the evidence has always been so maddeningly thin. For decades, everyone looked for the first Americans along that inland ice-free corridor. But a growing number of researchers argue the real road in was the coast. People moving south by boat, hopping down the Pacific shoreline, living off the sea. The kelp highway. Now here's the gut punch. The coastline those people would have walked is gone. When the ice age ended, sea levels rose more than 100 meters. The beaches, the camps, the evidence of the earliest arrivals, if it existed, is now sitting under deep water, drowned off the modern shore. Think about what that means. The record isn't thin because people weren't here. It might be thin because the ground they lived on is at the bottom of the ocean. It's like finding footprints on the far side of a bridge and then realizing the bridge sank a long time ago. The prints are real, the road that made them is underwater. So the strongest proof of the first Americans may be permanently out of reach, not hidden by any person, drowned by the sea itself. And that reframes everything, because it means the missing evidence the Clovis defenders kept demanding may have been unfindable from the start. But one piece of evidence was not underwater. It was in a drawer in Seattle, and it was about to end the entire 20-year war with a single result. In 2015, a team led by geneticist Morten Rasmussen, with Eske Willerslev and Carlos Bustamante, did what the 2004 court could never do. They pulled DNA out of the Ancient One's hand bone. It was brutally hard. The bone looked pristine on the outside, but inside, the genetic material was shredded and swamped by soil bacteria. They squeezed a genome out of almost nothing, and the result detonated the skull measurements that had ruled for a decade. Kennewick man was not Ainu. not Polynesian, not European. He was closer to modern Native Americans than to any other population on Earth. And among the groups they could compare, one showed a particularly close genetic affinity, the Colville, one of the 5 tribes that had claimed him as an ancestor from the very first day. Let that land. The skull said stranger. The DNA said ancestor. The measurements said the tribes were wrong. The genome said the tribes had been right the entire time. The same team had already sequenced another ancient American, the Anzic child, a Clovis-era burial in Montana, roughly 12,700 years old. That baby, too, was ancestral to living Native Americans, and showed the first Americans had already split into branches. Kennewick man fit inside that family tree. He was never an outsider. He was a relative. The science had spent 20 years trying to turn into a specimen. So let's be clear about what the war actually accomplished. The scientists framed the tribes as the barrier to knowledge. They fought through the courts for the right to study a man his descendants wanted to bury. They built a case on skull shape that a genome erased in a single paper. In the oral tradition, a federal court had dismissed as legally meaningless here since time immemorial, turned out to describe the genetic truth better than the craniometrics did. I want to be careful here, because the easy version of this story is a lie. There was no secret committee, no cover-up. NAGPRA's defenders weren't hiding anything. They were protecting graves. And the skeptics, the Clovis holdouts, the people who cried contamination, a lot of them had real methodological points. Old carbon is real. Disturbed layers are real. Extraordinary claims do need extraordinary evidence. This was not a conspiracy in the movie sense. It was something more ordinary, and honestly, more dangerous. Certainty, protecting itself. The old timeline wasn't stupid. It was built from the evidence people actually had. But a clean story has a way of becoming a career structure. Textbooks, museum labels, grant priorities, reputations. And once it does, changing it starts to feel like an attack. So the field didn't collapse when the evidence came in. It resisted, it doubted, it delayed. And the people carrying the inconvenient dates paid for it in years and reputations before the field quietly caught up. And that's the part nobody put on a plaque. The retreat. Clovis, first, didn't die in one dramatic afternoon. There was no press conference, no apology to Tom Dillahay for 20 years of doubt, no correction issued to the graduate students whose sites got buried under fatal flaws. The model just changed clothes. Migration maps got redrawn to run down the coast. Textbook language softened. Clovis first became one of several early cultures. The dates crept older in the footnotes. The old certainty didn't burn. It slipped out the back and let the new wording take its place. In February 2017, the ancient one went home. After nearly 19 years in that museum, the 5 tribes reburied him, quietly, on their terms. The DNA that scientists had fought so hard to extract became the same result that ended their legal claim to him and put him back in the ground. So walk back to where we started. 2 men wading in a river, lifting a skull they thought was a rock. That skull was called Caucasoid. It was called a specimen. It was called too important to bury, and it turned out to be exactly what his descendants said from the first day. An ancestor, one of the oldest known members of a family that never left. What's verified? He's roughly 9,000 years old, he's genetically Native American, and Monte Verde and White Sands put humans in the Americas far earlier than the wall ever allowed. What's still fought over? The oldest edges of the dates, the full acceptance of the Ice Age footprints, the coastal route. What may never be known, how far back it really goes, because the earliest chapter of that story is likely 100 meters underwater, off a coastline that no longer exists. The drawer in Seattle is empty now. The footprints at White Sands are still pressed into that old lake bed, waiting for the next objection and the next test. And somewhere off the Pacific coast, under cold, dark water, the beach where the first Americans may have actually landed is still down there, unexcavated, unfunded, unseen. The old story wasn't a lie, it was just too small. And it got smaller every time the ground, or the sea, refused to cooperate.